Hello and good morning, friends. Welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that from time to time we try to conduct different sessions under different subjects, and our objective is that you could get in-depth knowledge on various subjects and various topics too. Dear friends, in our previous session yesterday we talked about John Dryden. We discovered who John Dryden was. Today in this session we are going to talk on Origin and Development of Satire and its use by John Dryden only. Friends, for the discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Inayat Chaudhary. Dr. Inayat Chaudhary is a subject expert of English, and through the CEC's live platform she always believes in giving her best, her knowledge to the students so that they could be benefited as a whole. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Inayat Chaudhary on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our toll-free number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. All dear friends are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Inayat Chaudhary, and would request her to explain us in detail the today's topic. Hello, Dr. Inayat Chaudhary.
Thank you, Kitika. Hello, students. In today's session, we will be talking about what satire is and its development, and how John Dryden used it in his works. So before I begin, I would request you to look at my previous sessions where I had spoken about the 17th century in detail, as well as John Dryden, where I had chronologically looked at the way he went forward to write his works, which was deeply intertwined with the contemporary times in which he lived. So let us begin. Now we need to understand, and I want you to wonder, what is satire? How did it originate? How did it develop? And how John Dryden used it in his works? To answer all these questions, students, today's session would be extremely beneficial for you. So let us start. Satire. For many critics, it is believed to have originated from the Roman phrase lanx satura, meaning full or mixed platter. Similarly, it is also believed to have certain Greek origin, as satire is also thought to have originated from the word, in fact the Greek word satire, meaning a malcontent who is half human, half beast. So students, as you can see here, for some critics satire has a Roman origin, and for some it has a Greek origin. In fact, one can say that, one can assume that it has come down to us from both the forms, be it the Greek origin or the Roman origin. Let us look at it in further detail. So a Roman rhetorician known famously as Quintilian considered it to be a Roman phenomena, as he confidently had stated, satire is wholly our own. So he considered satire to have Roman origin. Similarly, the period of 15th and 16th century, it was believed that this genre of satire evolved from the Greek plays. Like I said, for some it has a Roman origin, and for some it has a Greek origin. Similarly, as we move forward, one notices that satire could also be Christianized form, such that various references are visible of it in the prophetic scriptures. So students, what one observes here is, for some critics it has a Roman origin, for some Greek origin, for some Christian tilt. But where did it originally come into being? Let us look further. A famous critic known as BAKHTIN considered it to have descended from the popular cultural festivals famously known as Roman Saturnalia, as well as public spectacles and various medieval carnivals. In fact, students, when I move ahead, you will realize that I will be doing a thorough analysis of what satire is for BAKHTIN and how he relates it to the concept of carnival. Let us move forward. For critic Thomas J. Mlitti, the author of Satire and the Hebrew Prophets, he states the nature and characteristics common to both prophecy and satire explain their frequent intermingling and shared identity in the scriptures. The message of biblical prophecy is pervasively and predominantly criticism. And criticism is always the content of satire. So for a critic like him, satire has a Christianized origin. For various other critics, it is believed to have come from the Roman side, and for many others, from the Greek side. So it is not clear where exactly satire came into being. But perhaps, students, one can have a rough idea, one can establish in their minds that where all one can trace the origin of satire to. And this information will help you to proceed further. So what exactly do I mean by the term satire? When I'm using the word satire, it generally seems to suggest that it is like a mirror in which a man sees everyone's face. And this is a certain reference that one can think in a layman's language if one has to define satire. It is a way of mocking, it is a way of imitating to send out a moral message. This is what satire is. In fact, when I was talking about the Greek origin of satire, it was used extensively by Aristophanes, who belonged to the old comedy. He wrote old comedy in the Greek literature. And Aristophanes made use of satire as a form of political satire, personal satire. This is how he made use of satire, to mock the political times, to pinpoint the shortcomings, to pinpoint the corruption that was taking place in his contemporary times. When one comes down from old comedy to new comedy, as we know, we have little left of middle comedy, but when one comes down to new comedy, students, here we are talking about Greek literature, where the comedy can be categorized into three kinds: old comedy, middle comedy, and new comedy. In new comedy, we have a famous figure known as Menander. For Menander, satire was used in a milder form. For him, satire was used as a realistic form. Therefore, students, satire serves different purposes for different people. But in a generalized sense, satire is used to imitate and reflect upon the contemporary society. So whether it is Aristophanes using it for to fulfill his or target the political aspect of contemporary society, or whether Menander uses it to hit the realistic aspect of the political society and its shortcomings, satire was used extensively during the Greek literature, in the Greek literature. Now let us come to the next point. So like I said, so this is how you can trace satire's origin. So what exactly was it doing? It was a social commentary with a moral message. The tone can range from sharp attacks to gentle mockery. Moreover, it could be towards an individual or a social group. Now I would want you to halt here for a minute and try to understand some other terms regarding satire. Satire, by some critics, is also categorized into two kinds. One is the burlesque and other is the parody. Now what is the difference between the two? when I refer to the burlesque kind of satire, it is basically an attack. It is a generalized attack. But when I refer to the second kind, the latter one, parody, the attack is specific. The target is specific. So students, I just brought it in to give you further categorization of satire. Some also divide it further into a term known as travesty, and so on. So therefore, students, satire also is of many kinds and many forms. And therefore, it was easily used and applied in the literary circle. In fact, even today, it is constantly being applied in various dramas. In media also, you must have heard of the famous show The Simpsons. What is it? It is nothing but satire. So it is being applied in various art forms, and it is not just restricted to the literature. Okay, let's go back. So satire, what is exactly is the purpose of satire? When I'm talking about satire, my purpose is to provide a moral judgment. Satire helps to provide a moral judgment. Similarly, it is also used to criticize various forms of injustices, like corruption, vices of human beings, the shortcomings, the negativity that exists in the society. Satire pinpoints all of this. At the same time, it also is delivering a moral judgment. When it is being read in a written form, or it is being watched by the audience in a dramatic form, it helps the audience to view it both subjectively and objectively and understand in greater detail what satire comes to apply. Apart from moral judgment and apart from various forms of injustices that it criticizes, it is also relevant because it helps to correct the ill happenings. So it is not just criticizing, it is not just delivering a moral message, but it is also helping each one who is part of it, actively or passively, to correct it, to correct the wrongdoings that is going on in the society, to understand and distinguish and draw a thick boundary between the right and the wrong. And therefore, student, such is the beauty of art forms. And one of such art forms is literature. Therefore, students, satire forms an integral part of literature, and since centuries it is being used, be it in Greek plays, be it in the Roman works, and be it in middle century, Renaissance period, Enlightenment period, and so on. Let us move forward. Like I said, satire can be categorized into several other parts. Now, somebody who's making use of satire makes use of certain elements to pinpoint all of this, to criticize, to correct, to deliver a moral judgment. Somebody who is making use of satire makes use of parody, makes use of exaggeration, makes use of irony, mockery, ridicule, and humor. These are some of the elements which are chiefly used to pinpoint the aspect of satire. Similarly, allusions are also used to pinpoint what satire is about. So it's basically concerned with the ethical reform of the society. Sometimes satire can be explicit and sometimes it can be implicit. That is, you have to dig deeper under the layers or dig the layers further to understand the proper meaning of satire. Further weapons, like I discussed, that are used to understand what satire is about is caricature is also used, sarcasm is also used, burlesque is used, irony is used. All of this form part of satire. In fact, an integral part which helps the readers, which helps the viewers, the audience to grasp the message being delivered by the writer. Let's move forward. So like I said, now it becomes easy for us to understand that satire is nothing but like a mirror in which a man sees everyone's face. This quote, in fact, beautifully explains in a simple and a lucid manner what satire is. When we move forward, one comes to realize the earliest proponents of satire can be traced back to Aeneas and Pausanias. But it was established and made use of in complete sense by Lucilius. Lucilius was followed by Horace, whose usage of satire was milder. But it was during the period of Juvenal, in whose writing, in whose literary pursuing did the satire reach the use of satire reached its zenith. So students, I helped you to understand what satire is, and as we move ahead throughout, I will be helping you to understand more deeply and develop a greater clarity on what satire is about. We also traced the origin of satire, and now as we progress, we will see how it developed down the centuries. But before that, it is important to understand in what categories or how can we classify satire. Let us look at it. When we look at the classification of satire, one understands that in a broader sense, of course, like I said, there can be a lot of categories, but if you have to categorize it or classify it in a broader sense, it is divided into three kinds. The first one is the Horatian satire. The second one is the Juvenalian satire. And the third one is the Menippean satire. Each of these satires differ from each other. So let us begin with the first form of satire, or the first kind of satire, the Horatian satire. So Horatian satire is a way in which satire is used in a mild and a gentle tone. Therefore, students, when one makes use of Horatian satire, it is a gentle version. It is milder. It is less of negativity and more of humor involved. There is no bitter commentary. Similarly, a famous critic, Matt Malpass, in his work, Critical Design in Context, History, Theory and Practices, states that it works through paradoxical techniques of burlesque, colloquialism, exaggeration and anticlimax. This form of satire is named after the Roman satirist Horace. The picture of the famous personality can be seen on the screen. So Horace was an important figure and he was a Roman satirist. In fact, the next form of satire, which is the Juvenalian satire, is named after another famous figure known as Juvenal, who again was a Roman satirist. But Menippean satire belongs to is named after the Greek literary figure. Okay, let's get back to the Horatian satire. So I defined Horatian satire for you, but to make it even clear further, let us look at the definition put forward by the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms. As per Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms, satire is Horatian satire, to be specific, is more indulgent, tolerant treatment of human inconsistencies and follies, ironically amused rather than outraged. So this is a key term here. There is a sense of amusement which is introduced when one looks at Horatian satire. It is not negative, there is no bitter commentary, nobody gets outraged by its use. So this is what Horatian satire is about. It is less savage. This was used not only during the Roman period. As one moves down the century, it is used during the Middle period by Chaucer, Rabelais. We move further down, it is being used by Pope. Similarly, Mark Twain, Daniel Defoe and some others extensively make use of it. And like I said, even in contemporary times and other forms of media it is used, and one such example is The Simpsons. So to be specific, when one looks at the works of Mark Twain, it can be chiefly seen in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In Swift's work, it is chiefly Gulliver's Travels where one gets to see it. But very interestingly, Swift makes use of satire in one of such works. But again, in another of his works, The Modest Proposal, he makes use of Juvenalian satire. Now, another form of satire that I want to pinpoint here is that in modern satire forms, satire is used more as a political aspect. It pinpoints the political follies. So, a lot of critics call it the political satire. And this form of political satire, like I had discussed earlier, goes back to the old period of old comedy in Greek literature, which was dominated by the literary figure of Aristophanes. So Aristophanes makes use of the political satire, whereas Menander, who belongs to the new comedy of the Greek literature, makes use of a realistic form of satire. So students, here I discussed with you the Horatian satire. Let's move forward and try to understand what is Juvenalian satire. So Juvenalian satire. Juvenalian satire, as I stated earlier, is named after the Roman poet Juvenal, who belonged to the 1st century BC. Unlike the Horatian satire, it is bitter, harsher, and involves condemnation of the subject. Matt Malpass, like I had quoted him earlier, speaks of Juvenalian satire as making use of violence, antithesis, obscenity, exaggeration, strong irony, and allegory. So if you want to understand further what satire is about, students, I would request you to refer to his work, which is Critical Design in Context, History, Theory, and Practices. So like discussed earlier, unlike Horatian satire, this is more evil and dark, and it often attacks political setups and organizations to demonstrate the corruptions and hypocrisy. Similarly, the elements of anger, pessimism, negativity echo throughout the Juvenalian satire. One of the best examples to understand what Juvenalian satire is to read George Orwell's Animal Farm. George Orwell's Animal Farm is a masterpiece of political satire, as some call it, or you can even find strong elements of Juvenalian satire in it. In it, he is criticizing basically the Russian communism. And the quote that you can see on the screen is one of the, in fact, the last commandment of animalism. And this quote beautifully itself is depicting the whole idea of Juvenalian satire. To understand it further in reference to George Orwell, I would request you to read this work, which of course is popular for various other reasons. So it instills, the form of Juvenalian satire instills a sense of anger due to elements of shock and ridicule, which are very strong. Religion and politics, where these aspects come into play, you would not miss out the usage of Juvenalian satire taking place. There is less emphasis on humor. Amusement is less, like I had discussed earlier when I was talking about Horatian satire. It is abrasive, it is cynical. Now, why, let us try to understand, Juvenalian satire or Juvenal began writing a satire which was much different from Horace. This is because of his own personal life, and like I had discussed earlier in my last session, that all the literary figures are influenced by the historical and the political settings to which they belong. Much like that, Juvenal also was influenced to write a bitter and attacking satire, which came to be known as the juvenile satire during his time. But why? Let us see. His satiric works deal mainly with life in Rome. Why? Because he was affected by the emperor and his wrongdoings. And this emperor was known as Domitian, as well as his successors were also corrupt. And this is what compelled Juvenal to write a bitter commentary on the wrongdoings, on the vices and the corruption that penetrated all the stratas of the society. He attacks openly the hypocrisy of mankind through this form of satire. And that is why I am reminded of a famous quote by Horace, that when you're living in such a time which is marked by corruption, which is marked by negativity, it is difficult not to write satire. And that is why it is used extensively down the centuries. Because you are being impacted, you are subjectively being impacted in the society that you live. And a responsible citizen, you use your weapon of the pen to attack the vices, to condemn, to put forward a moral judgment, to correct by critiquing the wrongdoings of the society. So therefore, all of these satires also suggest the kind of life that existed in Rome. So corruption and ill happenings were also a dominant aspect during the Roman times. Let us move forward. The next form of satire is the Menippean satire. Students, like I had discussed earlier, unlike the earlier two satires, which is the Horatian satire and the Juvenalian satire, which were named after the Roman satirists, the third satire, which I call the Menippean satire, is named after the Greek satirist Menippean. This satire is a bit different from the previous two satires that I had discussed. Why? Let us try to understand. It's believed to have influenced Seneca and the Greek satirist Lucian. Students, I would like to say here that if you want to understand Menippean satire in greater detail, please do look at Mikhail Bakhtin's various works, as well as Northrop Frye's works. These two literary critics chiefly deal with the Menippean form of satire and have done various research on these two aspects of satire. So students, I had spoken about Horatian satire, then I spoke about the juvenile form of satire, and now I will speak about Menippean form of satire. I would request you to understand and recall my previous sessions so that it helps you to establish and it helps you to move through my various sessions and concretize your understanding of the 17th century, of the concept of satire, about the literary figure John Dryden. Now, before I move ahead with Menippean form of satire, I would request you to relax and also try to comprehend the meaning of satire. Students, I will be discussing the Menippean satire in my next session. Till then, thank you.
With this note, we would like to thank Dr. Naya Chaudhary for giving us a productive session where we discovered and tried to understand the origin and development of satire. Dear friends, we will be back after a short break and would be continuing further. Till then, you are requested to be with us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, in our previous session we discussed on the origin and development of satire. In this session, friends, we are going to talk on how John Dryden make use of satire. And friends, for the discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Inayat Chaudhary. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Inayat Chaudhary on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Inayat Chaudhary, once again, and would request her to explain the topic in detail to us.
Thank you, Gitika. Students, let me take back you to my previous lecture, where I had spoken about the origin of satire, where I had spoken about how it developed, and where I had classified the satire into three categories: the Horatian satire, the Juvenalian satire, and the Menippean satire. Before we move on to analyze how John Dryden makes use of satire, I would like to discuss Menippean form of satire. So let us begin with the Menippean form of satire. The Menippean form of satire is more complex than previous kind of satires. It combines to ridicule many targets. It is also known as the Veronian satire, as reflected in the works of not only Menippus but also Marcus Terentius Varro. So some also call it the Veronian satire because it is reflected in the works of both these literary figures. Let us try to understand what exactly is Menippean form of satire. M.H. Abrahams classifies Menippean satire as one form of indirect satire, the category opposed to the formal satire of direct criticism in the first person. Similarly, Paul Salzman considers it as a genre as rather ill-defined and describes it as a mixture of allegory, picaresque narrative, and satirical commentary. So students, in my previous talk, I had said that if you want to understand Menippean satire in a greater detail, there are two literary personalities that you should be reading. The first one is Northrop Frye and the second one is Mikhail Bakhtin. So in this form of satire, there is no single or primary target. It seems to attack everything. Unlike the previous satire, there is no specific target. It also consists of several fragments of satire. So various layers of satire works through the literary forms when it comes to Menippean form of satire. It also tends to mix genres and collapses the categories. Further, the mental attitudes are criticized here, and along with mental attitudes, that is the intellect that is criticized, one also sees references to bodily fluids being made. Now, to understand it further, I have put in the way Northrop Frye and Mikhail Bakhtin view Menippean satire. But students, if you want to understand it in a furthermore greater detail, please do read their works, as this would not be sufficient. So let us begin. Critic Northrop Frye states that Menippean satire moves rapidly between styles and points of view. Such satires deal less with human characters than with single-minded mental attitudes or humors that they represent: the pedant, the braggart, the bigot, the miser, the quack, the seducer, etc. So like I had stated earlier, Menippean form of satire seems to have no particular target or a primary target. There are various layers that involves the Menippean form of satire. Similarly, like I had stated earlier, bodily fluids is an important aspect here, and the intellect is what is being attacked here, and that is what Northrop Frye states in his discussion on Menippean satire. For him, the novelist sees evil and folly as social diseases. But the Menippean satirist sees them as disease of the intellect. So the intellectual capacity is what is satirized here. Like I said, the intellect becomes an important aspect here. The mental attitudes are criticized here, and that is why there is no specific target but a generalized target. And so Northrop Frye makes references of the quack, the miser, the seducer, because there is no specific target here. Now let us move forward. Satire and how Mikhail Bakhtin makes use of or explains the idea of Menippean satire here. Okay, before I continue with this, I would say that if you want to understand Menippean form of satire in the works of Northrop Frye, I would say that he revived this term in Anatomy of Criticism, and that is one work that you should be looking at to understand the Menippean form of satire. Okay, so let's move ahead. How is Mikhail Bakhtin exploring the idea of Menippean satire? To understand it, let us look at the way he deals with the Menippean satire. He considers it to be belonging to serio-comic genre. Therefore, he makes references of it in his work Theory of the Novel. Similarly, if you want to understand it further, you should not only refer to Bakhtin's Theory of the Novel, but also refer to his work Problem of Dostoevsky's Poetics. These are two works which discuss the idea of Menippean satire extensively and how it is linked to various concepts like carnivalesque and the carnival. And this is what Bakhtin talks about, and he tries to establish relationship with other forms, like I said. So let us move ahead. He finds the mode of carnivalesque and the fantastic echoing in this kind of satire. Now, what does the term carnival mean? I'm drifting a bit, but it is important for you to understand how Bakhtin views satire and how he is relating it to the term of carnival. Carnival is a place, a realm, a dimension where everything is permitted, excesses are allowed. There is a sense, it's a social space where there is freedom and equality. And this idea of carnival, this kind of freedom, Bakhtin feels, is visible in not just the Socratic dialogue, but also the Menippean satire. Similarly, the term carnivalesque is derived from carnival. And that is where we can see how it originated from. So basically, what Bakhtin is perhaps suggesting here, that this Menippean form of satire depicts the elevation of comedy. Why? Because it becomes a social space, it becomes an area where you get a certain form of freedom, where there are no restrictions, where you can subjectively engage in all that you wish to engage in. So this is what Menippean satire for Bakhtin is, and this is how he relates it, not just to the aspect of comedy, but also to concepts like carnival or carnivalesque. And therefore, for Bakhtin, satire is inherently dialogistic. This is another important, significant statement that he makes. Let us move ahead. He further talks about Menippean satire and brings forward various characteristics. Let me discuss all the characteristics, or let me mention all the characteristics one by one. Unlike the Socratic dialogue, Menippean satire is more comic. Similarly, it is unusually free from history, realism and legend, and hence it is fantastic. The idea of fantastic echoes throughout the places where Menippean satire is being used. Its fantasies create extraordinary situations for the purpose of testing philosophical truth, especially through the manipulation of perspective. Moreover, it is a genre of ultimate questions, combining bold invention with broad philosophical reflection. It uses the spheres of heaven, earth, and hell to look at these ultimate questions. So, like I said, satire is used for moral judgment. It is used to correct the vices as well as criticize them. And this is exactly what, in a generalized sense, even Menippean satire is doing. but it becomes different from the other forms of satire in the sense that it is more layered. It is not target specific. Other points can be read here, like it is multi-styled, it is multi-toned, it combines elements of social utopia with other satiric elements, it inserts a variety of other genres, often to parody them, it is concerned with current topics. For instance, he states the satires of Lucian taken as a group are an entire encyclopedia of his times. So like I said, satire also reflects upon the contemporary times to which the literary figure belonged. Moreover, like I said, it uses experimental fantasticality, that is observation from some unusual point of view, to make it more interesting, to give a different preview to the whole situation. And it often represents unusual states of insanity, split personality dreams, excessive passion, creating a dialogic relationship to one's own self. And finally, scandal, eccentricities, inappropriate speech, violations of politeness and social expectations are also deeply engraved in this Menippean form of satire. So students, we have now understood various categories of satire, be it the Horatian satire, the Juvenalian satire, or the Menippean form of satire. Prior to the classification of satire, we try to understand where all it is considered to be originated from by various critics. Some consider it to have a Greek origin, for some it has a Roman origin, for some it is mentioned in the Christianized scriptures, and so on. Now let us look at how satire is being used in the 17th century. If we want to understand how satire is being used in the 17th century, we need to once at least briefly go back to the historical context in which John Dryden lived. That is the 17th century, like I stated before. And to understand it in detail, please refer back to my previous sessions. One was on John Dryden and one was Introduction to 17th century. But here I will give you a brief about it so that you can immediately relate to what I am trying to say. So 17th century was marked by religious and political shortcomings. There was a constant battle. Both of these issues were intertwined with each other. John Dryden had royalist sympathies. He was also known as a turncoat. And Samuel Johnson famously stated, so what? If he's just changing with the changing times, there's nothing wrong in it. And this is what John Dryden did. He was a royalist sympathizer. But before that, he wrote a panegyric for Oliver Cromwell. And when Charles II, who returned from exile, he was exiled during the Civil War, during the Restoration period, which is 1660 onwards, when he returned from exile, he started writing works of praise for Charles II. And that is why he was considered to be an opportunist. Who? John Dryden was considered to be an opportunist. So how was he writing his work? He was writing his work through the usage of satire. He made use of satire to mock various not only literary personalities but also the religious setup of his time. Similarly, he also attacked the political setup through the usage of satire. Like I had stated before, satire is both implicit and explicit, and that is why John Dryden makes use of satire as and when it suited his needs. Initially, during the 17th century, unlike the refined form of satire or the mature form of satire that one gets to read in the 18th century, it's important, students, to understand that during the 17th century, satire was being written in a more informal way. Scribbles were being written where satire was being used for broadside. So it did not have a concretized written form or a mature form that one gets to see in perhaps the work of Jonathan Swift in the upcoming century, the 18th century. So during this period, like I said, satire was being chiefly used for various reasons. It was morality based, it was political based, and sometimes it was also defense based. And this can be seen in the works of the country gentleman and Hudibras. So there's immense variety of satire that is to be used. You can classify it, you can categorize it. You can develop various characteristics of satire, various elements of satire which is used. And again, like I said, literature and the historical and political setting is what deeply affects the literature. And this is what we get to see here. Now, in the 17th century, Samuel Butler, Marvell, Oldham, Dryden, to mid-century satirists like Cleveland, whose works were reprinted regularly in the 1660s and the later 1670s. These men were the ones who were chiefly using the form of satire. Similarly, for contemporary critics, for instance, the critics of the 21st century or the 20th century, they consider satire, which is used not just morally, but for abusive and nasty aspects. So like I said, satire has various categories for which it can be used. Now, this is again, let me go back. Why during the 17th century, satire was an important literary form. Why? Because there was a constant tussle between the religion and the politics. We had Charles II, who was an ardent supporter of Church of England, who was a Catholic, who was a royalist. We had James II, and then we had William III, who was now a Protestant. And to move through all these ruling periods, it was very important to make use of satire. You can't be open about criticism. You have to hide under the layers to put forward your idea. Otherwise, censorship is what you had to face. You had to face public criticism because there were a large number of public supporters. Like John Dryden was removed from the post of poet laureate once William III came to rule. Why? Because he refused to demonstrate his allegiance to William III. So it was not easy to write during those times. And you had to hide and be implicit about the ideas or the criticism that you're putting forward. And that is why satire was being used. Now let us move forward. So Dryden's works, Absalom and Achitophel, makes use of it. Flecknoe makes use of it. The Medal makes use of it. They are all the front runners of satire. How is Flecknoe use of it? Like I said in my previous session, Dryden had engaged in various public brawls, and one of those literary personalities with whom he engaged in a public brawl was Thomas Shadwell. And Thomas Shadwell is whom he mocks and imitates through the usage of satire in his work Flecknoe. Similarly, in Absalom and Achitophel, which defends the monarchical succession, which tends to show Dryden's royal sympathies, is also and is engraved with various satirical references to various plots. Mythologized figures, allegories have been made use of, and this is how satire penetrates deeper into the literary works of Dryden to attack the contemporary society, the rulers whom he did not support, the rulers whom he wanted to defend, and so on. Similarly, his plays in the 1680s are proper examples which demonstrate the political resonance of all of it. Examples: The Spanish Friar, Dryden and Natalie's The Duke of Guise, Marriage à la Mode, The Kind Keeper, or Mr. Limberham. In fact, in this work, he mentions in his dedication and states that it is an honest satire against a crying sin of keeping. So, you can see that throughout his work, remnants of satire can be seen. Even if it is work Marriage à la Mode and The Kind Keeper, one sees social satire. The Medal demonstrates powerfully the attacks on Whigs, particularly Shaftesbury. The Spanish Friar warns against challenging rightful authority. And the Duke of Guise is an open political satire. Therefore, the idea of satire became relevant during this, not only the 17th century, but also to various literary figures, and like we are talking about John Dryden, for him too. So Dryden, through his works, seems to be more of a political satirist as well as a moral one. He makes use of allegories, which is an important aspect of satires, and the beast allegory is used in his various religious works which were written during the 1980s. The hind and the panther makes use of beast fable. There are allusions that has been used, there are allegories that are used here. It is nothing but a form of satire. So various elements of satire are used to demonstrate powerfully not just the criticism, but an attempt to correct the vices of the satire, vices of the society. So this is what satire was about. And that's why it became an important weapon, it became an important tool to deliver a moral judgment, to offer a social commentary of the corruption that had penetrated the entire society. In fact, Dryden had once stated that more libels have been written against me, he complains in his discourse, than almost any man now living. How interesting it is. And who better than John Dryden knew this? He wrote several works criticizing, commenting, correcting various aspects of the society. And none better than John Dryden becomes a powerful representative of the 17th century. He also becomes a representative to what happens if you're a supporter and to what happens if you're a foe of the dominant rule. Now, like I said, the satire which is used by Dryden undergoes constant transition under different rulers. This is also very important to understand. Satire is engraved deeply into the 17th century. But like I said, it is used with modifications at various times. So, during later times, he adopts an indirect way to bring forward his ideas. Unlike the earlier times where he was more open, more explicit, because during that time, he was a royal sympathizer. And 17th century England was being ruled by Charles II, whom he supported. It was being ruled by James II, whom he supported. And for that reason, in fact, as a matter of fact, he was made the poet laureate. He wrote various panegyrics for them. And he was immediately made the poet laureate. But when he refused his allegiance after the Glorious Revolution, when William III came to rule with his queen Mary II, when he refused his allegiance to them, who were the Protestant, he was immediately removed from that position. And it was then he realized that now he has to take a back seat. He has to be less explicit. He became more defensive. And this is what now we are trying to understand, that how he made use of satire during his later times. For instance, in his work known as Cleomenes, published in the year 1692, he makes clear in his epigraph from Juvenal, I dare assure you that here is no parallel to be found. It's neither compliment nor satire, but a plain story. Look how smartly he deals with it. Clearly, John Dryden is a man of many talents, which can be seen in my previous lecture also. Did that mean he never made any references? Of course not. But what he was trying to show was that now he's silent about criticism. Not just criticizing the vices of the society, he's now also silent about offering social commentary to the various rulers of his times, chiefly the Protestant ruler. And that is why he makes it clear that now I'm taking a back seat, I'm just writing a normal story, please don't interpret it in any other manner. But like I said, this was not true, and of course, many critics, not only of his time, but also of later times, were intelligent enough to read between the lines and understand what John Dryden was hinting towards. Let us move forward. Similarly, in his 1690 work, the idea of abuse of power, visible in his work, Amphitryon, makes use of a form of covert satire. It's not coming out in the open, but it is very implicit. That can be seen here. In fact, an important critical personality, Wynne, says of late life Dryden that his cause was indeed lost, but he was willing to be a patient sufferer, supporting himself by his pen, and he did not regard the occasional political jibes in his plays and prologues as threatening any real disturbance to the government. So he took a back seat, but he was well aware about the political jibes that he will continue to use, but in a more subtle manner. So like I said, various classifications of satire can be seen resonating throughout his work, be it the Horatian form of satire, be it the Juvenalian satire, or be it the Menippean satire. Now let us move forward, students. So this is what John Dryden and his use of satire was all about. If I have to conclude what satire is about, one realizes that satire is an important tool to provide a benefit to the audience. Why? Because it helps to understand the mindset of not only the literary personality, but it also pinpoints the contemporary times to which the literary personality belongs. And that is why I have mentioned here that satire becomes a tool of power. Similarly, satire also introduces before us the concept of secrecy. It introduces before us concepts like censorship. Why is it doing that? Like I said, satire is being used extensively not only during the 17th century but also during the 18th century extensively. And therefore, a lot of times various works were banned, where satire became a bit explicit, where it became clear who was being attacked. Satire was banned. And that is how satire becomes an important element, literary form and a literary form, which even today is being used in various dramatic productions, in various literary genres, and so on. And before I end my session on satire, I would like to end it with a quote by the famous M.H. Abrahams. He defines satire in his glossary of literary terms as, satire can be described as the literary art of diminishing or derogating a subject by making it ridiculous and evoking towards it attitudes of amusement, contempt, scorn, or indignation. It differs from the comic as in that comedy evokes laughter mainly as an end in itself, while satire derides. That is, it uses laughter as a weapon and against a butt that exists outside the work itself. Therefore, students, in today's session, we try to understand the origin and development of satire, how satire developed during the 17th century, and how a famous literary figure whom many regard as a man of many talents, that is John Dryden, made use of satire. Students, I hope to see you in the upcoming sessions. Thank you.
With this note, we would like to thank Dr. Inayat Chaudhary for giving us a vivacious session on satire, and we believe that all dear friends might have learnt a lot. Friends, if you have any questions, any queries, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. This is the ID where you can post your questions, and yes, of course, we'll try to give your answers in our live session through Dr. Inayat Chaudhary when she comes next in the studio. Till then, dear friends, take care, and yes, keep watching us, keep writing us. We would be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary.
Thank you, Kritika.